about ready to get started? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special event. In accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on December 11, 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observed, "Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence." This is one of the foundational and indeed vexing questions being explored by our two-day conference on violence and values in today's world. My name is George Cheney. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and the director of the Center and Associated Programs that I'd like to tell you just a little bit about today. It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce the Barbara L. and Norman C. Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy here in the College of Social and Behavioral Science, and to acknowledge its partner, the Peace and Conflict Studies program in the College of Humanities. These programs were born out of a vision of the Tanners and realized by resourceful administrators and committed faculty at the University of Utah. Our programs are all about building bridges, not only between the two colleges I mentioned, but also with many others on campus, including the S.J. Quinney College of Law, a co-sponsor of this event, social work, education, fine arts, business, science, and medicine. Our efforts span theory and practice in addressing problems ranging from interpersonal violence to global social and economic injustice. We are supported by a board with great experience and insight. Together with our various collaborators in Utah, in several parts of the United States, and on the international stage, we are sponsoring or co-sponsoring research symposia like the one before you, an interdisciplinary undergraduate minor, special courses on dialogue and advocacy, K-12 outreach, student internships, and an array of speakers and workshops. We are working closely with groups in the community to promote multi-stakeholder dialogues on pressing social, economic, religious, and environmental issues. Also, we will sponsor graduate fellowships for students across disciplines, focused on the questions of conflict resolution, peacemaking, and human rights, both at home and afar. To inaugurate this center, to celebrate the generosity and commitment of Barbara and Norm and their daughter, Deb Sawyer, and to introduce our distinguished speaker, I now turn to our visionary and dynamic president, Michael Young.
I am delighted today to welcome you on behalf of the University of Utah. I'm a little cautious because normally when one is on the stage, one is singing or dancing. I assure you I will do neither today to your great benefit. We are thrilled to welcome, we have many distinguished guests in the audience, deans, professors, members of our community, professors from other universities. We're just thrilled to have all of you with us. But most of all, I want to welcome the students who are with us today. As you look up here at the front, you will see old people. We are only getting older. The future of this enterprise and our capacity to accomplish the aspirations of this wonderful center really rest with you. So we're particularly pleased to have all of our students with us today, as well as those who will listen to this later as it is otherwise broadcast. The University is extremely pleased to host the Values and Violence Conference discussing the intangible aspects of terrorism. This could not be a more timely conference or a more important conference in terms of the issues that we need to address. The capacity for military solutions to these problems is, as has been evident for 100 years, limited, very limited. The need to drill down and find other ways in which we really can address these issues, creating just and humane societies where all people can realize their potential becomes extraordinarily important. But reach their potential despite the difference in views and values that people might hold. So this is a particularly fitting way to inaugurate this wonderful center that's been now established here at the university. And I want to give special thanks to those who have been most instrumental in making this possible. The Institute of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Utah, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the S.J. Quinney College of Law. Deep thanks to the members of our Distinguished Advisory Board for their hard work and dedication in bringing this conference to the university. In particular, thanks to Dean Chatterjee of our faculty, who was instrumental in bringing Dr. Sen, as well as Dr. Muslim, with us, and we are thrilled to have both of you here, and Dean, we are grateful. Thank you. But particular thanks today also to the Barbara L. and Norman C. Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy. Barbara and Norman Tanner and their daughter Deb Sawyer showed exceptional generosity and leadership and foresight in establishing this center. And I say foresight because the center is looking to the future of our state, of our nation, and indeed our world, as it reaches out not only to the students here on this campus, but to students and teachers in all of Utah's schools, K through 12, as well as university students around the state. We're sorry that Norm can't be with us today, but pleased that members of the Tanner family have joined us from across the western United States to celebrate this wonderful day. And now we know that Barbara and Deb both want our focus to be on Dr. Sen today, as we do, but we would like to take a moment to thank both of you personally, and wondered if you would stand and accept a small token of our appreciation. Created a center that can sponsor conflicts of this sort, one that has already created an extraordinary buzz on this campus, even in the day and a half in which it has been going. So we are thrilled and look forward to many more opportunities to pursue the values that have been identified as the founding principles of this wonderful center. So now it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Amartya K, who is the perfect inaugural lecturer to begin the Norman and Barbara Tanner Forum. He is a distinguished economist, philosopher, an honorary advisor to Oxfam, a Nobel Laureate, and the Lamont University professor at Harvard University. He's also been a visiting professor at MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, Cornell. Until recently, he served as the master at Trinity College at Cambridge and has since returned back to Harvard. He has served as the president of the Econometric Society, the Indian Economic Association, the American Economic Association, the International Economic Association, and if there were a galactic economic association, he would have been president of that as well. He's received honorary doctorates from major universities throughout the world, and the recipient of many prestigious awards, all deeply deserved. He's received the Bharat Ratna Award, which is the highest honor awarded by the President of India, the Alan Sean Feinstein World Hunger Award, the International Humanist Award, the Eisenhower Medal for Leadership and Service in the United States, the Presidency of the Italian Republic Medal, the United Kingdom's Companion of Honor Award for Outstanding Achievement in Science, the George E. Marshall Award, and of course, as we all know, the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998 for his groundbreaking work in famine, human development theory, welfare economics, and the underlying mechanisms of poverty and political liberalism. His research covers a remarkable array of topics, all of which have been in fields of extraordinary importance. Theory of measurements, public health, gender studies, moral and political philosophy, welfare economics, development economics, the economics of peace and war. He is a one-person faculty, perhaps best known for his contributions to decision theory, including social choice theory. Dr. Sen's written more than 30 books on these subjects, translated into more than 30 languages. But it's also important to understand that his focus comes from very personal experience, deeply based in his own life. Let me quote just a paragraph, if I may, from the autobiography produced when he received the Nobel Prize, and I quote, "Some of my own disturbing memories as I was entering my teenage years in India in the mid-1940s relate to the massive identity shift that followed divisive politics. People's identities as Indians, as Asians, or as members of the human race seemed to give way quite suddenly to sectarian identification with Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh communities. The broadly Indian of January was rapidly and unquestionably transformed into the narrowly Hindu or finely tuned Muslim of March. The carnage that followed had much to do with unreasoned herd behavior by which people, as it were, discovered their new divisive and belligerent identities and failed to take note of the diversity that makes Indian culture so powerfully mixed." As we consider the world around us, the power of those words hits home, particularly as one sees the escalation of divisions across the globe. Our lexicon is filled with those divisions: Arab and Jew, Sunni and Shia, Bosnian and Serb, and even closer to home, hawk and dove, liberal, conservative. How critically important it is for us to learn alternatives to violence and to teach others the same. For that reason, it's an extraordinary honor and pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today, one of the great minds of our time, Nobel Laureate Dr. Amartya K.
First, I'd like to say how touched I am by the very kind words of President Young. And it's a great pleasure for me to revisit this university and to join you all here. And also, given the fact that my connection with the Tanner family goes back to the fact that I gave one of the early Tanner lectures in Stanford, I think it was, it came out in the first volume, and fairly rapidly followed by giving also one in Cambridge, which I think filled up my total quota of lifetime possibility of giving Tanner lectures, but established my very close sense of admiration for what the family had done, and learn more about the new center, rather enormously Tanner Center, and on the subject of such importance is also quite thrilling for me. And of course very grateful to the University of Utah, not only for its kindness in inviting me, but also for arranging a conference here on the important and indeed urgent subject of values and violence, intangible aspects of terrorism. Given the rampant presence of violence and persistent outbreaks of terrorism in the fiercely turbulent times in which we live, it's important to investigate whether and how these transgressions and brutalities connect with the values that are cherished and cultivated in the world. The subject of this lecture is, violence in identity. But more generally, I must consider the broader connection between values and violence, the general subject matter of the conference. I can well imagine that some people here may take the skeptical view, plausible enough, I suppose, that I must be quite unfit to talk about values since I'm primarily an economist. And an economist, we have been told repeatedly in the form of the famous story, fame knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. That aphorism is sometimes backed up by Edmund Burke's 18th century complaint that economists are partly responsible for extinguishing forever, quote-unquote, the glory of Europe. Presumably because those whom Burke called sophists, economists, and calculators know so little about the deeper values that make life worth living. I must, however, plead in my defense that I lack the sophistication needed to qualify as a genuine sophist, and also know extremely little about prices of anything anywhere. I've been telling myself that this level of abysmal ignorance about crisis cannot but be rewarded by generating some understanding of values in me, if the dissonance between crisis and values emphasized in the often repeated famous saying is right. So I have to give it a try, even if I'm led there, and as you may have noticed, by a very unsound argument. It would actually be very hard for anyone to miss the fact that there must be some obvious connection between values and violence. Wars and strikes have often been fed by appeals to certain types of values that emphasize differences with others, while glorifying dedicated warfare in defense of what is seen as one's quote-unquote own people, the country, the nation, the community, or whatever. For example, appeals to country and nationality played a rousing role in the immensely bloody war in Europe between 1914 to 18. We're talking little about those experiences because somehow the violence of the present time has made us forget how violent the times were not long ago. In fact, the number of people killed in all that going on right now, all the nastiness, is a tiny, tiny, almost a negligible fraction of the people that died in those violent events in the world wars in the last century. Before the horrors of the First World War took the freshly recruited Wilfred Owen's life in the battlefield field, he had the time to write his own protest about values that glorify violent combat for the cause of one's fatherland. This is a poem called Dulce et Decorum Est. My friend, you will not tell with such high zest to children ardent to some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori. That ringing endorsement of the honor of death from Horace for allegedly for one country could be seen as catering to the violence of nationalism, and it was this invocation against which Wilfred Owen was emphatically protesting. The same kind of sectarian glorification translates easily into similar celebration of the imagined honor of dying and killing others for many different types of collectivities, not just nation and citizenship, but also religion, race, community, or the newly popular but deeply defuncting category now called civilization. The mesmerizing appeal of such sentiment is devastatingly used today, just as in the past, with newer areas of explosive application to entrap the young in a magnification of the nasty ways of the old. The children ardent for some desperate glory, as Owen called them, are often ready to blow themselves up, to blow out others. The tactic of suicide bombing and other techniques of super-violence may be new in today's world, but it's extremely important to remember that the exploitation of the violent in the use of identity-based reasoning has been in use for a very long time in many different forms, particularly those based on appeals to nationalism. Even suicide attacks were in use during the Second World War, made famous by kamikaze pilots from Japan destroying naval vessels of their allied forces, so even that is not new. More generally, forms of belligerent identity with one's nation, pitted against quote-unquote enemy countries, generated and sustained a violent sentiment that fed the warriors in many wars, including the two world wars. Wilfred Owen, who was quoted earlier, was raising his voice against just this process. The Second World War, unlike the First, did have some other appeals to loyalty as well, since there were major ideological issues in addition to nationalism, such as fascism and Nazism, as well as pluralist democracy and communism. And yet there was some role for national identities too, both in Europe, for example in the cultivation of German nationalism in Nazi Germany, which had a territory of its own that transcended the general philosophy of Nazism, and in Asia, for example, in the Japanese hostilities in China. It's useful to remember the coexistence of the two faces of nationalism in Japan. The positive face that gave encouragement to the Japanese to make spectacular economic and social advance to catch up with Europe, and the negative face that allowed and even encouraged the atrocities perpetrated in the wars that were waged. It was that pervasive duality that disturbed Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet and writer who Martha Nussbaum quoted yesterday, who saw in the Japanese experience a huge example of the fragility of the creative aspect of nationalism. The Japanese military adventures graphically illustrated for him how the elevating identity with one's own nation could deeply confound even a country, Japan, with such great past accomplishment and also such rapidly growing further achievement. Achievement that could be, as it happened, better fostered by peace rather than by war, as Japan's post-war experience focused. Tagore went on writing about and lecturing in Japan on his criticism of what he saw as a deflection from the creative side of national unity. Rabindranath Tagore's much publicized criticism did not convince at that time many people in Japan, and the main effect was that Tagore rapidly lost the huge following he earlier had in Japan. But there were also continued efforts from Japan to get Tagore's sympathetic ear, both because his views were influential in the world and because Tagore had been so quote-unquote pro-Japanese earlier on. In 1938, Yone Noguchi, the distinguished poet and friend of Tagore and also of W.B. Yeats, wrote a pleading letter to make Rabindranath change his mind on the subject of Japan's relations with China and with other countries. Rabindranath's reply was altogether unambiguous and stubborn. He wrote to Noguchi on the 12th of September 1938, I quote, "It seems to me that it is futile for either of us to try to convince the other, since your faith in the infallible right of Japan to bully other Asiatic nations into line with your government policy is not shared by me. Believe me, it is sorrow and shame of anger that prompt me to write to you. I suffer intensely, not only because the reports of Chinese suffering batter against my heart, but because I can no longer point out with pride an example of a great Japan. You know I have a genuine love for the Japanese people, and it's sure to hurt me too painfully to go and watch crowds of them, the Japanese soldiers, being transported by their rulers to neighboring lands to perpetrate acts of inhumanity which will brand their name with a lasting stain in the history of man." Unquote. Rabindranath would have been much happier with the post-war emergence of Japan as a peaceful power, and by its reassessment of its role and responsibilities in the world. But he had died even before the Second World War was finished. When I had the opportunity many years later to have some fairly long conversations with the Japanese novelist and writer Kenzaburo Oe, he and I did a joint tour of some Japanese cities arranged by a leading Japanese newspaper. So we were together for about a week. I was struck by the many different ways in which Oe's deeply humanistic and constructive vision, which actually found an expression even in his Nobel lecture, fitted in with Tagore's own hopes about political priorities, not least in the Japan Tagore used to love and admire so much. The violence in identity-based thinking can come as a tide, but, and this again is extremely important to remember in the increasingly dejected contemporary world, it can also recede very rapidly. For that to happen, we have to think through and act on the real problems that need addressing, non-imagined ones, that defog the mind and confound policy options. In what follows, I want to pay particular attention to two distinctions that look like cases in terms of appearance of comprehensive dissonance, and yet which are, in fact, deeply interrelated and interdependent. The first distinction is that between the two phases of identity on which I've already said something. There is a phase that generates warmth and the one that champions hostility. The relation between the two phases can, I think, be seen in terms of the contrast between identifying with one's so-called, quote-unquote, own group, that is, with other members of the group to which this person is persuaded that he or she, quote-unquote, actually belongs, and the other phase that sustains and sometimes feeds hostility to non-members of that distinguished group. It is the symbiotic relation between the two contrary phases, with love for members and non-love for non-members, that makes identity such a potent force in the world, with great creative powers on one side and massive destructive potential on the other. To go with commenting on the two phases of identity with one's nation, but the problem is, of course, much more simple than that. The recent outbursts of violence have been linked with other chosen groups and other selected identities, such as religious, for example, Al-Qaeda as a global terrorist movement, and ethnicity, for example, the Hutu violence against Tutsis in Rwanda a little over a decade ago. The second dissonance that I want to talk about deals with thinking about the roots of violence, including terrorism, in two contrasting and apparently unrelated lines of explanation. One doing in primarily economic and material terms, which could be perhaps in the context of the conference called the tangible aspect, and the other through cultural and political factors, which roughly speaking may be thought of being the intangible aspects. The first line of explanation is well illustrated by seeing violence and terrorism as being ultimately the result of economic poverty and social deprivation, which generate the anger and disquiet that burst into violence. The second approach can be illustrated by attempts to explain violence through the influence of identity politics, cultural alienation, and the fostering of sectarian thinking, which can similarly lead to strife and turmoil. In trying to link them together, I will argue that each line of explanation has some explanatory power on its own, but also has some deep weaknesses when seen in isolation. There is a need for a fuller picture that demands a more integrated understanding. I'd like to suggest some elementary ideas on how such an integration could be attempted, but first I must say more about each of these distinct elements separately, seen on their own. How can a thesis linking poverty to violence be illustrated? This is not hard to do, at least in terms of immediacy, if not critical sustainability. Many countries have experienced and continue to experience the simultaneous presence of economic destitution on one hand and political strife and violence on the other. From Afghanistan and Sudan to Ethiopia and Somalia, there are plenty of examples of the dual adversity faced by people in different parts of the world. It's not surprising that possible connection between the two great afflictions that characterize the contemporary world, namely violent and persistent conflict and massive economic inequality and poverty, it's not surprising that the connection should attract attention. Even though definitive empirical work on the causal linkages between political turmoil and economic deprivation may be relatively rare and very rare, the basic presumption that the two phenomena have firm causal links has considerable plausibility and is very commonly taken to be just true. Furthermore, it's not uncommon to presume that a basic characteristic of an enlightened attitude to war and peace, if you would like to take, must go beyond the immediately obvious into the quote-unquote underlying and quote-unquote deeper causes, including economic ones, of these phenomena. And that we must look for the roots of this conflict and disorder in economic destitution. Sometimes this connection is given a ready-to-use shape in the form of what may be called economic reductionism, whereby social and political strife is explained straight away by what are taken to be their quote-unquote hidden economic roots. The empirical claim that poverty is responsible for group violence is, however, far too simple, both because the linkage of poverty and violence is not at all universal, but also because a serious causal analysis is needed to identify the ways and means to which poverty can influence violence in a fuller understanding of the causes of violence. Destitution can, of course, be provocation enough to defy the established laws and rules, but it did not give people the initiative, the courage, or the actual ability to do anything very violent. Indeed, destitution can be accompanied not only by economic debility, but also by political helplessness. A starving wretch can be too frail and too dejected to fight and battle, even to protest and holler. It is thus not surprising that often enough intense suffering and inequality have been accompanied by complete peace and quiet. Indeed, the economic connections between poverty and violence are quite complex and far from capturable in the simple form in which economic reductionism tends to proceed. For example, the violent history of Afghanistan cannot be unrelated to poverty and indigence that the population has experienced, and yet to reduce the causation of violence there entirely to this singular economic observation would be a gigantic mistake. Much of it is clearly involved, related to Afghanistan's particular history, including Soviet occupation, the emergence of militant Islam, American role in feeding the rebellion against the Soviets to assisting economic Islamic political groups and then deserting them, the part played by neighboring countries, including Pakistan and its link with Taliban, and so on and so forth. We have to try to understand how these multi-factor processes work and how the different causal influences work together and often kill together. The observed empirical connection between poverty and violence are quite contingent on many other circumstances. There is, to be sure, no dearth of evidence of conflicts and confrontation in the economy, with a good deal of poverty and much inequality, but at the same time, there are also other economies, with no less poverty or inequality, that seem to stay stuck or stuck just in economic hardship, without necessarily generating serious political turbulence. Indeed, very severe poverty and even acute famine can coexist with evident peace and apparent tranquility, as it happened many times to occur without there being much political rebellion or civilian strife or intergroup warfare. For example, the famine years in the 1840s in Ireland were among the most peaceful in that country, and there was little attempt by the hungry masses even to intervene as ship after ship sailed down the River Shannon laden with rich food, carrying it to well-fed England, taking them away from starving Ireland. Not as a part of government design, but just by the market forces. The British had, the English had a much higher perceiving power of these richer foods. It would be amazing if such experience of deprivation and malgovernment, and the Irish times of the 1840s, would be hard to beat as spectacular examples of both, were to leave no impact on peace and quiet in the long run. But the influences did not work with the immediacy and simplicity that the deprivation-centered understanding of violence would require. So what about the alternative lines of explanation in terms of cultural and political alienation, and the divisive effect of singular identity. I wonder whether I could request to have a glass of water. Just, with my problem with suddenly my voice going dry. I have to say that if I had some power, I would have tried to put some light in the auditorium too, because the center of my being entirely isolated, and everyone has gone away. It's fairly strong, and I'd like to be reassured that people are still here. But that's a harder expectation to fulfill, I guess. Identity is certainly a double-edged sword. We have to recognize the basic fact that identity-centered sentiments have many positive and socially constructive features. The new schools of communitarian thinking, which have flourished over several decades now, have done much to bring about the positive features of communal identities to life. The perception of identity over a broad group that crosses country borders has also done much to generate and sustain demand for fairness and justice across the world. This applies to anti-racist political agitation, defending the rights of the racial underdog in many different countries, as well as to feminist and more generally to gender egalitarian movement for equity between women and men, again crossing borders. The world would be a more impoverished place without the social and political commitment directly inspired by the identity of disadvantaged people with other people who are similarly deprived. A sense of identity can be a source not merely of pride and joy, but also of strength and confidence. And it would be wrong to see identity only as a problem rather than as an asset. And yet, identity can also kill and decimate with abandon. A strong and exclusive sense of belonging to one group can go with a perception of distance and divergence from other groups and can contribute to fomenting conflicts organized around group categories. Within group solidarity can go hand in hand with between-group discourse. And as I've tried to investigate in some detail in my last book, Identity and Violence, this could be a very complex phenomenon. But a lot of it is done by direct appeal to one specific identity. We may be suddenly informed that we are not just Rwandans, but specifically Hutus. We hate Tutsis. Or we are not really near Yugoslavs, but actually Serbs. We absolutely don't like Albanians. From my own childhood memory of Hindu-Muslim rights, I saw how, and I discussed here with President Estani, quoted the sentence from me there about how the broad Indians of the month of January, I think I said, within a few months could be converted into the separately defined, ruthless Hindus or fierce Muslims within a few months, transforming the entire territory. By the way, those rights will come in some places. In some places they have a longer history, but in some places like my own Nepal, on both sides of the border, it came like a hurricane, it went like a hurricane, it came in the 40s, and by the end of that decade it was all over. 1950s would say Bangladesh bursting into patriotism about language, Bengali culture, in which most Hindus and Muslims were on the same side, rather than the Hindu-Muslim discord of pain, rapidity, and frantic rapidity. The broader identity that got suppressed during those brutal moments would return again before long as the storm passed. But meanwhile, hundreds of thousands perished at the hands of people who, led by the captains of carnage, flayed others on behalf of their quote-unquote own people. Violence is fomented by the imposition of a singular and belligerent identity on gullible people. championed by proficient artisans of terror. The currency of group love leaves room for an invitation to group hatred. The cordiality of identifying with others as an affiliated group seems to stand in constant readiness to be extended to the scalding and burning of others, excluded from and seen as an enemy of one's own affiliated group. Our understanding of the role of identity has been very substantially enhanced. We have to recognize by new explorations of social psychology and public action. I'm now discussing the positive aspects of identity because I don't want to lose sight of that. Even though a good deal of traditional economic theory tended to rely exclusively on the assumption of purely self-interested conduct, and I've been writing about it and protest about it for about 40 years, there have been important recent developments, for example by Akerlof, Cranton, Davis, Kerman and others, in incorporating identity-based thinking in the characterization of economic behavior and in investigating the far-reaching accomplishments of this motivational broadening. It has also been enriched by the discernment of the positive contributions of quote-unquote social capital, analyzed definitively by Robert Putnam and others in the form of people's propensity to help others in the same community with this then spontaneity that would be hard to generate by narrowly self-centered behavior of intellectually sequestered human beings. Communitarian theorists, from Chuck Taylor to Michael Sandel, have also shown the positive role played by the recognition of identity with one's own community in yielding impressive social achievement at a reflexive as well as material level. What must, however, be added to that understanding generated by these investigations is a basic recognition that the sense of identity can totally exclude many people, even as it warmly embraces others. The well-integrated community in which residents instinctively do greatly helpful things for each other with immediacy and solidarity may also be the community in which bricks are thrown through the windows of immigrants who move into the region from elsewhere. It has been observed, for example, that anti-immigrant violence aimed at the Turks trying to settle in Germany has sometimes been sharpest in precisely those regions of the country where the solidarity of the local old communities is strongest. The adversity of exclusion can go hand in hand with the gifts of inclusion. The so-called social capital may fail to be capital in the basic sense of the term, that it being an all-purpose resource to promote desirable objectives in general, since the same social disposition may make the lives of some, the outsiders, much more balanced, even as it helps the lives of insiders to flourish more fully and more easily. To understand the brutal potentials of identity-based politics, we have to see that this operates through prioritizing some identities and downgrading the relevance of other identities, including our broadest identity of a shared humanity, but also identities linked to economic, political, and other social commonalities. What makes the divisiveness of an imagined unique identity potentially so brutal and relentless is not the mere presence of that divergence, but the overlooking of the other identities that human beings also have, and which too can claim our attention and tend to diffuse the critical sense of we versus they in terms of one identity. Identity politics acquires its deadly potential by denying the claims of identities other than some one identification that is championed for use in fomenting a particular belligerence. A Hutu laborer from Kigali may be pressured to see himself only as a Hutu and incited to kill Tutsis, and yet he is not only a Hutu but also a Kigalian, a Rwandan, an African, a laborer, and a human being, all the identities that the Tutsi may also share. In resisting this invitation to violence, there is need not only to recognize the plurality of our identities and their diverse demands, but also the important role of choice in determining the cogency and relevance of particular identities which are inescapably diverse. The use of identity-based thinking in generating conflict and violence is closely connected with the illusion that identity is just a matter of quote-unquote discovery, to use the word that has been so much favored by in the communitarian literature, rather than also of choice. Encouraging that illusion of choicelessness is a part of the martial art of the architects of sectarian violence, and not just of sociological theories. But it has also been encouraged, and this we have to admit, by cultural theories that try to classify the world into self-contained baskets of civilization, a line of reasoning that precedes any thesis of a class of civilization, but on which the class thesis, that is on the categorization of civilization, and on this the class thesis parasitically depends. And it's also present, I have to say, and tell my communitarian friends often, in obsessive communitarian thinking that sees the world as a federation of communities, overlooking all the other identities that human beings simultaneously have. So far so good, at least as far as explanation goes, though we are dealing not with good but bad phenomenon of cultivated divisiveness. But is it adequate to see the phenomenon in wholly or even mainly isolated and endogenous terms? How do the manipulators of divisive identity end up being so successful? Why do they fail sometimes and succeed in other cases? To see the entire process in terms of the irresistible machinations of wily instigators would be to miss out a central feature in the cultural process involved in the privilege and its consequences of identity-based violence. A big difference can be made by the exploitability of potential grievance, discontent, and disaffection, which can provide fertile ground for the alienating campaigns of identity politics, whether we are talking about how the Turks, quote-unquote, ruining Germany, or how, come back to Van Nussbaum's talk yesterday, how in the propaganda machinery, how the dominance of the Muslim traders group in Gujarat indicates that there is a need for a different kind of deal, not to mention the immediate events you discussed, namely the fire and the train in Gujarat. There is always a particular thing that we exploited. This is where the other causal factor, to with poverty and deprivation, can link up and magnify the force of identification. The sense that the world, coming to the big division that we are now looking at, terrorism, with the terrorism is so much associated these days, at least in the analysis that we see, the sense of the world is divided between haves and have-nots. Greatly helps in the cultivation of past disaffection, opening up possibilities of recruitment in the cause of what is seen as retaliatory and even remedial violence. In order to understand how this works, it is necessary to distinguish between the leaders of violent insurrection and the much larger population on whose support the leaders rely. Leaders like Osama bin Laden do not, say the list, suffer from poverty and may have no economic reason to feel left out from sharing the fruits of global capitalism. And yet the movements that are led by leaders of violence rely greatly on a sense of injustice, iniquity, and humiliation that the established world order is seen as having produced. A growing tolerance of terrorism by an otherwise peaceful population is another peculiar phenomenon in many parts of the contemporary world. particularly those that feel badly treated by the privileged people of the world and have the sense of being left behind in global economic, social, and political processes. A feeling of unfairness in the unequal sharing of the benefits of globalization has often been linked to help both the recruitment of the cannon fodder of terrorism and the creation of a general climate where terrorism is tolerated and sometimes even celebrated by a population as it basically freely peaceful. The years of the Irish famine in the 1840s may have been a time of peace and law and order. It was perhaps the peace of the grave, as some might be tempted to say, but certainly it was peaceful. But the gigantic experience not only led to massive emigration of the Irish to America, but it also left a lasting legacy of Irish anger against British dominance. In the violence of the Irish separatist movement, which had happily at last calmed down after nearly a century, could not be understood without reference to the history of malgovernance and deprivation in Ireland that preceded it. I could have added, by the way, that even with the Hutu-Tutsi violence, the fact that the Tutsi were the traditional upper classes and could be seen to have governed over the Hutus played a major part in the rhetoric that started off those brutalities. Similarly, the memory of ill treatment of the Arab world by Western powers, including the free redrawing of the boundaries of the Middle East, just as the colonial powers will, still lingers in West Asia and contributes to the ability of terrorists to recruit volunteers for violence. What is seen as the violence of quote-unquote Islamic extremism has many components, but the anger of the ill-treated has a huge role in facilitating its appeal and reach. Since the recent events of the Middle East, including the war in Iraq, have done nothing to remove that memory, in fact quite the contrary, the grievances that the channel into violent results remain totally untamed. And grievance-based thinking, which dominates so much of what is happening in the Middle East today, also encourages other complaints and other protests, like we have discussed, how that links with the searching through history to bring out the Shia-Sunni differences and who did what to whom. And as a result, you are in a kind of backwardly looking mode and discovering new reasons for grievance all the time. The connection between identity-based alienation and deprivation-based conflict can work in many different ways, of which the potential for violence through the exploitation of grievances against those who are seen as fostering or even just tolerating deprivation is only one. But there are other links as well which also deserve attention in the context of the conference topic which we're discussing. And for example, the role of cultural generalization, which play a very big part in linking deprivation on one side with the creation of the base for violence on the other. Cultural generalizations have great effectiveness in fixing our ways of thinking. The fact that such generalizations abound in popular discourse can be easily recognized, though their effect is not often so easily seen. At least they have been relatively little analyzed. Not only are discriminatory convictions the frequent subject matter of racist jokes and ethnic slurs, they sometimes surface as grand theories. When there is an accidental correlation between the particular cultural prejudice and actual economic and social contrast, a theory is born. And it may refuse to die even after the chance correlation has vanished without a trace. Consider the frequency of labor jokes against the Irish, such crudities as how many Irishmen will need to change a light bulb, which has had much currency in England for a long time. It has superficial appearance of fitting well with the depressing predicament of the tumbling Irish economy when the Irish economy was indeed doing quite badly. The economic deprivation of Ireland got merged with the cultural prejudice of the English society, going all the way back to Spencer's Faerie Queene. Such prejudices have lives of their own, and quite defiantly of the phenomenal world that can be objectively observed. It can remain current and active public thinking. Even when the Irish economy started growing astonishingly rapidly, indeed in recent years it has grown faster than any other European economy. Ireland is now richer in per capita income than nearly every country in Europe. The cultural stereotyping and its allegedly profound economic and social relevance are not chucked into the dustbin of dead thought. The close relation between deprivation and alienation can sometimes help to sustain each other in very powerful ways. I have discussed elsewhere in my book Identity and Violence how the cultural contrast and the associated identity fed by pre-existing deprivation can in turn help to generate further deprivation when the ruling powers use their economic and cultural differentiation as justification for their unhelpful policies. Indeed, the deep English skepticism of the Irish played a major part in allowing amazing malgovernance in Ireland, including terrible mismanagement of the famines of the 1840s. The head of the Treasury, Charles Edward Trevelyan, after sadly admit he was trained in Trinity during the famine, expressed his belief that Britain had done what it could for Ireland, even as the famine killed rampantly. In fact, the percentage of mortality, not often recognized, was larger in the Irish famine than any other recorded famine anywhere in the history of the world. Trevelyan also pointed to some remarkable cultural explanations of the manifest hunger, including, I quote from Trevelyan, "We have to look for causes widely. There is scarcely a woman of the peasant class in the west of Ireland whose culinary art exceeds the boiling of a potato," unquote. It's quite an interesting remark, not only because of the peculiar prejudice it shows when bringing in terms of the understanding of the famine, but also generally the English don't tend to make many international culinary criticisms. This is an exception. Very puzzling to those who are quite keen on culinary art, the Chinese, the French, and the Italian, or the Indian. It's not surprising that armed with such deep understanding and the collation of Irish famine, public policy made in London achieved remarkably little to stop the famine or to alleviate the suffering of the Irish. What it did was to leave a great legacy of Irish hunger and of course the ruined economy. Then, I must end. I will not try to summarize the different but interconnected points I've tried to make in this lecture, but I will separate out a couple of major concerns that I have, and which I would argue deserve much more attention than they tend to get. First, the cultivation of the singular identity as a basis of thinking about human beings carries the ever-present possibility of easy translation into violence and brutality. This does not, of course, be seen as denying the fact that the singular identification has often played a very beneficial role. But the two faces of identity, the creative and the destructive, are closely linked together. And I wish communitarians would take a note of that. And the cultivation of the former always carries the potential of the potential of the latter, of which we have to be aware. And there's always the possibility of that the groundwork for identity-based violence being created on the basis of what looks like a very positive sense of warmth towards others in the same family, same family, same community, same nation, same religion, same one group or the other. A singular concentration on nationality has been a part of the martial arts used in sustaining battles in many past wars, which have killed many thousands of times more people than terrorism has so far killed here, and it is killed in the world in our time. And a similar role can be and often is played today by a singular concentration on religion or community or ethnicity or culture. What is perhaps more disturbing is the recognition that what the artisans of terror do by design, that is indeed their weapon, the befuddled fighters against terrorism on the other side also actually end up doing and strengthening through lazy and unclear thinking, by falling to the simple temptation to define people mainly or even only by one identity only. This will happen, I discussed in my book, in a big way in separating out, say, British Muslims as a category. There's no such category anymore left. My Bangladeshi friend in Britain, who used to be very proud of the fact that the second language in London, second most spoken language in London, had to be Bengali because of the presence of so many Bangladeshis in London. That identity is now gone. They're just British Muslim, no nonsense about that. When a person is defined simply as a British Muslim or an American Muslim, not only is the richness of that person's plentiful life, his language, literature, profession, artistic and scientific taste, membership of other institutions and associations ignored, the person is invited or indeed pushed to a self-understanding that demands loyalty to that one identity only. Second, in the linkage between the two phases, constructive and destructive of identity, the contrast in economic and social consideration can play a powerfully effective role. That connection may work not only through the easy cultivability of the anger of the deprived, but also through feeding the prejudices of the affluent and the rulers of the world, in the past and even today. I would argue that we cannot begin to understand the conflicts that we see around us, and also those that have visited us over the last couple of hundred years, without seeing the role of economically, socially, and politically divided fortunes in feeding the whole and violence of identity-based thinking. The violence in identity can draw on other sources of division that characterize the world in which we live. Is not only that both identity and deprivation have roles to play in the generation of violence, that's true of course, but just not that only, but also that they cannot be seen simply as additive factors that passively and cumulatively make up the whole. They interact with each other, and these interactions change the nature and force of each of these divisive features. Our attempt to help cultivate peace in the world on the other side, that is, to take on this violence, to conquer terrorism, to conquer these violence and to cease. Our attempt to help cultivate peace in the world has to come to terms with the interactive and dynamic relations between these different but interlinked sources of tension and stress. World peace cannot, of course, be brought about by some magic bullet, but it does demand something of an inclusive vision that incorporates a fuller understanding in one picture of the interdependence between apparently disparate and dissonant factors that influence human life. Such an understanding can, I would argue, is quite important for the violence-ridden world in which we live today. Thank you.
Dr. Singh will accept one or two questions.
Any more than one or two if people have time. Oh, if they don't have, I will accept it, but there may be no time for me to accept it.
Yes, sir. If you'll wait for the microphone, please.
You brought up the discussion of us and them. I didn't hear you say anything about Clash of Civilization, which is a textbook at every university campus in this country.
Yeah. We were trying to persuade you to have the microphone. I must have failed in my microphone then, because I did talk about Clash of Civilization in the context. You see, I think I discussed it in the, I think it came in twice. One is to say why it's such a big ugly category, and the other is why the thesis of Clash of Civilization is parasitic on the categorization of people into one civilization each, taking the civilization as if they don't interact with each other, and assuming also that each person could be defined by the civilization to which he or she belongs. That is, I discussed both these issues quite extensively in the book Identity and Violence. That is actually where I think most of the pernicious harm is done. So I'm just as much opposed to those who want amity between civilization, but agree with seeing people in this reductionist one-dimensional term of each a member of one civilization and nothing else, and each civilization separated from others. They must be now somehow persuaded to enter into a dialogue with each other. Dialogue between human beings across the world are seen in the fantastic form as dialogue between civilizations, rather than the many-sided individuals that we are. That's where I'm resting my criticism on. I have some additional things to say, because I think the people who want amity in civilization are people with whom, in some level, I think they are also misled. But at some level, there's something in common, where the people who would proceed from the categorization of civilization to clash, I will let some further matter. But my talk today was on the first matter.
Around this side.
Yes.
Professor Sen, why do you believe there is so little attention given to the gay-straight division in humanity?
What is
The gay-straight division in humanity.
Gay-straight division?
Yeah.
Well, it could be, that could be fitted into the same categorization. I mean, I think the whole issue also comes whether defining people in that singular term and the hostility that it may be generated would be the, I mean, there are two ways of dealing with the prejudices against gays and the homophobia that we see in the world. One would be to say that there is nothing to be worried about that. That is a perfectly natural condition, and this is something that one can take up. And indeed, I was one of the main signatories of a campaign in India, which was started by Vikram Seth, to change an Indian law from the British days of 1861, which makes homosexuality a criminal offense. I don't find joint letters, unfortunately, because I'm usually asked to sign about 100 letters each week. So I told Vikram Seth that I would write therefore separately. And the result of that was that I got tremendous compliments since I wrote separate letters. They said, there is a protest by saying, in addition, Vikram Seth and others, and 160 Indian notables have signed the text. That is on the subject of saying that there's nothing, the full trail of gays is mistaken. But in the context of my present lecture, you're right to ask how does that relate. You didn't quite ask that, but let me take the question to be that. If that were the question to be faced, then one would say that whether defining a person simply as gay is an adequate way of understanding a person, as if that sexual preference overlooks everything else. The same person could be a gay, could be Muslim, could be Hindu or Christian, could be an American, could be Chinese, could speak Bengali or Swahili or something else. And hundreds of other identities which are relevant. So to exclude all of them and categorize people in these two terms would be a great mistake. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with specific issues like gay marriage or something like that, well, that is the subject in question. But in general, my point, I would say, applies just as much to the issue that you're raising as it applies to the ones which I already had the opportunity to discuss in my talk.
Professor Sen, you discussed identity, it seems to me, principally in terms of identities which are narrow and particular. I'm just wondering whether you could say something about liberal cosmopolitanism, because liberal cosmopolitanism presents itself as being a sort of universal identity. And so I'm just wondering whether you see this as being some kind of a further identity which we should consider the other identities, or whether it can be a solution to some of the problems you've been talking about, or whether liberal cosmopolitanism itself could be seen as a type of particularity. Thank you.
Well, I think liberal cosmopolitanism is a very important source of an identity setting. And here, Martin Nussbaum's work has played a major part, as well as Anthony Akio's. I think the focus of mine, which is, it doesn't contradict anything they have said, is that we can't think of that as the only identity. You can't say, I'm just that and nothing else. There are other identities too. When I'm being held up by the immigration service of any country, and this has happened to me several times, because everyone seems to be persuaded that I intend to live in the country to which I want to give a lecture, in which I want to give a lecture. To say that I am a global citizen doesn't really help, that's not the point. And similarly, to dissuade activists, feminists, let's say American feminists, to work, so to go to, say, Afghanistan or Somalia, to try to do something for the women, to say, look, why do you emphasize being a woman? That doesn't really matter, you're just a global cosmopolitan identity. That doesn't have science, because she's doing something very important in that context. Much was talked yesterday, said that the feminist groups were among the major ones that did something in the good violence. So these are important identities. And even though we should recognize the importance of our cosmopolitan identity, and just when my book was coming out, my friend Anthony Akio book was coming out, who was emphasizing that factor. But I had absolutely no problem with it. It was a beautifully analyzed thing. But I would also like to say that that is not my only identity. And I'm glad to live in a world in which people have other identities other than that as well. And therefore, I don't think any identity. It's ultimately an epistemological problem, even though it is tremendous ethical relevance. Epistemologically, we can't be described by just one identity. That's not the way we are. It's interesting, people even forget that even some people who emphasize one identity, how much concern they often have that they may be overdoing it. And the best example is Karl Marx. Because class identity was the thing that he was putting everywhere, and you can quote passages Marx indicating almost nothing else matters. But if you look at his last theory book, Critique of Roosevelt, 1875, there he's taking the German Workers' Party to task for seeing workers simply as workers. They're not human beings, they're not family members. He talks about family membership, and as Marx puts it, all other identifications are forgotten, nothing else is remembered. Now that's a protest about possibly the greatest class theories of all time, about why class cannot take that position. And I think Marx is right in this case. And I could say similarly when, say, Mary Wollstonecraft was discussing the issue of how to advance the vindication of the rights of women, emphasize that again and again, she reminds us that is not your own identity. I think that, I don't think any originality for my thoughts, in the sense that what I'm trying to do has been said before. I want to say more loudly and different audiences tonight, because it happens to be somewhat relevant.
I think we better stop.
You're in charge.
again, Dr. Sen, on behalf of the University of Utah, the Barbara Norman Tanner Center, the Institute for Public and International Affairs, the S.J. Clemmy College of Law, we have to get shorter titles here very soon. We are so pleased, and to the rest of the faculty of the conference, we are just so excited and thankful that you've been here. I would like to remind people that at 3 o'clock this afternoon in the Officers Club at Fort Douglas, and if this is being recorded off campus, Fort Douglas is part of the University of Utah. It's not a military base. We actually had a call in on that issue yesterday. We will be closing up trying to look at policy implications and broader implications of the discussions and the papers and the arguments today. It should be fascinating. We invite you to join us if you would like to. And President Young, thank you for your participation today, and have a good afternoon.